Hi, good afternoon. It's really nice to be here. Because for a long time at BBC News, data standards, metadata about news has been right at the heart of what we do in our digital product strategy. So I was really keen to come and talk here today. No slides, apologies. I've spent quite a lot of time thinking about what to say, also what not to say, because data standards impact so much for us. And we'll be publishing, I'll publish a version of this on the BBC Internet blog, a slightly grammatically improved version of this on the BBC Internet blog, plus the links that I'll be referencing tomorrow. So, Robin Pembrooke, as you said, run the teams that design, develop all of the BBC's digital news propositions on web, on apps, on connected TV. We reach about 185 million people a month. We operate in about 30 different languages. I'm going to talk about how we use data standards to both create and promote, if that is marketing the news, promoting our news and our news products across the online space. And I'll split that into three sections. What I'll talk about first is the context that we're operating in, this huge drive to being more mobile, more personal services, and critically, this much more diverse distribution ecosystem that we're operating in at the moment. Then I'm going to talk to you and leave you with some real examples, some current examples of how we're using data standards to both create and distribute the news and what we're doing with our news products. And then I'll finish by talking about partnerships. And I do want to talk a bit about the recent experience that we've had with Google on the Google AMP project. And I'd like to finish with posing a question of what we as publishers and broadcasters can do more together in relation to these challenges. So in terms of the context, news absolutely at a crossroads, and it is patently clear that the way in which people consume news is changing at a faster rate than it ever has done before. In the UK, TV news audiences are not falling away dramatically in the absolute numbers, in the way in which they might be doing in the States at the moment, but there is a definite demographic shift, particularly on news channels, of an audience that is getting significantly older. An older audience that's watching for longer, but if you talk to a younger audience and you talk to them about where are they getting their breaking or developing news, it's all about one device, and that is the mobile. Already for us, 70% of our digital traffic at certain times of the day comes in on mobile or tablet devices. Indeed, on the day after the general election in the UK in May, at sometimes 85% of our traffic digitally online was coming through to mobile devices. And for certain peak moments, the concurrent number of people on a mobile device was greater than the number of people watching BBC News on television. And that trend will only accelerate and go faster. The second thing is this explosion in the number of personalised aggregation services in terms of how people are consuming their news. Over 10 million people a day consume BBC News on Facebook. It's growing very rapidly. We're lucky that we're one of the we're cited as the most trusted source of news on Facebook and Twitter, and we've got huge audiences there. But also messaging services like Weibo, Snapchat and others, they're becoming the primary discovery mechanism for people in their 20s in terms of how they're consuming news. And and it's not just an issue for traditional news organisations like ourselves, even for the new entrants. For BuzzFeed, only 4% of the traffic to BuzzFeed comes through their homepage. For the rest of it, they have to be fighting for it out on YouTube, on Facebook, on Snapchat. So it's mobile, it's personal devices as a primary means of access to news is an irreversible trend. Everybody realises it's going to happen. And that's why what you're seeing at the moment is the most ridiculous battle between Google, Facebook and Apple fighting for people's attention in their hands on a mobile device and chasing the advertising dollars with competing different solutions. Facebook, with Facebook Instant Articles, announced last year, live this year, Apple, with Apple News, announced this year, live 2 weeks ago in the UK, and Google announced just 2-3 weeks ago with their new Accelerated Mobile Publishing Initiative, AMP. We're involved with each of those. Each are aiming to deliver content in a more personalised, ever quicker way on mobile. But what for us, that means we've got this almost unstoppable shift of a drift towards mobile, where the whole thing about promoting news and getting it consumed is around on personal and relevant services to users. Consumed not just on our own branded sites, but on third-party sites across the piece. So that presents, for incumbent broadcasters, that creates two main problems. One is of increased cost. So it doesn't matter how many people are watching a news channel or listening to a radio bulletin, it still costs the same to produce it. And every new outlet, Snapchat, Discover, publishers are having to create bespoke teams to be able to service these new channels. And at the same time of increasing cost, you have an issue of decreasing cost and complexity. You have an increase of a decrease in our ability to understand, measure, and monetize audiences on platforms that are not directly owned and controlled by the publisher. For an organisation like the BBC, nearly 100 years old, we've got the added complexity that our infrastructure and systems have been built up over decades, first around radio, then television, and then around online. You know, when BBC News Online was set up, it was set up on a completely different infrastructure and architecture, managed by different people who sat with different budgets in different parts of the room. Andy's nodding, remembers that. Although the good news is we are now managing those groups editorially together, it's a huge challenge in terms of working out how we begin to aggregate content from across those systems. So, you know, a complex environment with lots of challenges if you're an incumbent. But the good news is data standards, not quite riding over the hill to save the day, are playing a very central part in terms of how we promote and deliver and produce our news. Our digital product strategy is called Connected Stories. It's got linked data and data standards at its very heart. We use linked data and tags to be able to essentially, it's structured around a data ontology that was defined together with members of the IPTC. It's called Storyline, and it allows us to aggregate content to tell the full story from across the BBC. If it's a piece of radio content, TV content, or text-based content. It lets users follow topics. So in our new app, people can follow individual topics that matter to them, or they can see the news that's tagged with the place from where they live. And increasingly, it's how we will deliver recommendations and push notifications to users to promote stuff that we believe is of interest to them. If I give you a couple of examples of how that works. Internally, one of the legacies of the 2012 Olympics for us was the linked data platform. It's a single store of metadata across the BBC that stores metadata around individual items of content, be they from news or from television or from sport. If you search for the term Storyline on the BBC Internet blog, you will get a link through to the definition of how that is constructed and how it works. We've got about 100,000 topics in there now. It's growing by the day. But what we realized is that we needed not just a way to aggregate that content, but tools to be able to very rapidly create and curate that content as well. And so one of the things that we've done is created a topic-driven content management system, which is called Vivo, and the man responsible for it, or about to become responsible for it, is sat at the back of the room, called Alan. So chat to Alan about Vivo later. And we use it to drive all of our live services across the BBC digitally. So what it allows us to do is to aggregate content around football matches, around political events. We run a service called Business Live, rolling news around business, politics live, and soon we'll be using it to drive and curate individual topic pages that bring together content from across the BBC from radio, TV, and online. Externally for users, in our consumer-facing products, what that means is that people can follow topics that matter to them. And the interesting thing is that is proving, we're finding, a very popular way for people to discover and promote the news. So over 5 million users have personalised the BBC News app. On average, they follow about 8 to 9 topics. And what it means what it means at the present is they create a personalised My News feed. But in the future, what we're going to do is to allow people to personalise the news alerts that they get from the BBC. I suspect that some of you may have been awoken at slightly strange hours of the morning or evening with push alerts that come from ourselves or New York Times or whoever. And so we want to offer the ability to allow people to say, for example, turn off sporting alerts, or to be able to ask for more alerts about topics that really interest them. So in this complex world, a way of being able to allow people, sorry, not necessarily sporting alerts, but you know, they can use their AP app for that, right? Exactly. So a more personalised way of discovering content for people, addressing that long tail issue, and really allowing us to be able to understand more about users' want. So there are two very real examples of how we're using data and metadata to be able to transform our production processes to produce news in this fast-changing world, but also how we're using data and metadata standards to actually help customize how we get the news to our end users. And none of it would be possible without the kind of things that we're talking about here, data standards. So I've talked around that context, more mobile, more personal, more distributed. I've given those examples, and I said I'd finish by talking around partnerships and how we work together as an industry in this space. And please, let me say thank you to all of you in the room that have been involved in helping us and define those news metadata standards. I know they're used across the industry. Jeremy Tarling, who regrettably can't be here this afternoon, has worked on that storyline ontology. Really interesting to see the New York Times piece this week about atomized journalism, which is building off some of that same thinking about the storyline data model. It's interesting, though, I think, that in the last 12 months, arguably the fastest paced bits of industry collaboration and standards work have been driven not by publishers, but have been being driven by the behemoths of the internet, Google, Facebook, and Apple. In just the last 2 weeks, newsroom development teams across Europe have been scrambling to get the Apple News format live. And I think as an industry, we need to think about how we respond and engage with the owners of those platforms. Jeff Jarvis was talking at a European product management publishing gathering about 6 months ago, and Jeff he suggested that we as an industry needed to do two things, and I think we're halfway to completing the first. Now, that first thing that he said we needed to do was to establish a common standard for publishing web content that can be aggregated by others in a way that's scalable, low cost, repeatable, and in a way in which advertising revenue and metadata returns back to the publisher. And I personally believe, I think, with this fascinating Google AMP project, we're a good way towards achieving that first goal. But there's much work to be done in the run-up to it actually going live. It was a really interesting demonstration of how developers and product managers across the industry collaborate to establish common approaches. Although it's not a metadata standard, it's a coding approach. The Google format does look like it's going to be run as a proper open source project. And I think it's really important that all of us test that by trying to inform how it evolves and by writing things that adhere to it to see if it works for us as an industry. The second thing, though, that Jeff challenged us on was what us as publishers wanted in return for collaborating with the big platforms. He suggested, and it's become apparent during the Google AMP project, that the sticking point on this is not about content metadata, but about user data. At the moment, when we publish out to these platforms, we get back data, but it's very basic. It's at an aggregate level. It doesn't help us understand who the user is. It doesn't help us develop relationships with that user or be able to really understand them on an individual basis. And so that's what has got, I think, a few of us thinking that what might be the next big challenge for an organisation like IPTC might be not to continue to focus on common standards around our content, but to potentially think around the way in which we can, where there's obviously been huge progress over a long period of time, but to think about our standards around customer identifiers, around usage of content on wherever that content is being consumed. And because if we can do that in a consistent way, that might go some way to address this potential imbalance in terms of who owns the customer relationship and our ability to continue to understand and develop those relationships with users of our content, regardless of where they are consuming it. Much to discuss, but in summary, a very clear trend. It's more mobile, it's more personalised, and it's increasingly complex, dispersed environment in terms of how things are published. Data helps us with that. It reduces cost and helps us deliver more personalised experiences. But finally, with partnerships, it's interesting. We've made huge progress on content, but actually, can we begin to move forward and think around data standards around user consumption as well? Thank you very much.